Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of MGM Institute of Health Sciences, myself, Dr. Rita Khadkikar, University IQAC Coordinator, welcome you all for today's national webinar, The Future of COVID-19 Pandemic. We have with us Dr. Raman Gangakhedkar sir, our eminent speaker, former head Epidemiology and Infectious Diseases ICMR, presently holding C.G. Pandit National Chair ICMR, also a Padma Shri awardee. We welcome you, sir. We also have with us Honorable Chancellor Shri Kamal Kishorji Kadam, Chairman MGM Trust, Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Shashank Dalvi, and Pro Vice Chancellor Dr. Nitin Kadam. I welcome all the participants, academicians, educationists, the curious and the learned participants for this national webinar. The schedule for this webinar is as follows. We will begin with the welcome address and introduction of our eminent speaker by Pro Vice Chancellor Dr. Nitin Kadam, speech by Dr. Raman Gangakhedkar sir, moderation and concluding remarks by Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Shashank Dalvi, and vote of thanks by Dr. R.B. Goyal, Registrar, MGM Institute of Health Sciences. On this occasion, I take this opportunity to offer a tribute to all the COVID-19 warriors by observing a 1-minute silence. Request all the participants, if you have any queries, kindly type it in the chat box. We will be considering it during the moderation session. I now invite Pro Vice Chancellor Dr. Nitin Kadam to give the welcome address and introduce our speaker for today. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khadkikar. And good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on the future of COVID-19 pandemic. With reference to your last slide, Dr. Khadkikar, I would like to say a bright future is always built upon the sacrifices of many people. And so on behalf of all of us, I salute them and start with today's proceedings of the meeting. As we all are aware, the COVID-19 pandemic is the defining global public health crisis of our time and the greatest challenge we have faced since World War II. Since its emergence in Asia late last year, the virus has spread to every continent except Antarctica. This pandemic is much more than just a health crisis. It is also an unprecedented social, economical crisis, and its effect will leave deep and long-standing scars on all of us. The virus was identified in late December 2019. This led the WHO to declare the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern on 30th January 2020. If you look at in just 9 months, on 26 September, if you look at today, 26 September 2020, more than 32 billion cases have been reported. More than 9,93,000, almost touching 10 lakhs deaths, and more than 21.5 million are recovered. But these recovered also suffered. And as far as Indian scenario is concerned, the first case of COVID-19 was reported on 30th June 2020. As of today, we have the largest number of confirmed cases in Asia and the second highest cases in the world after the United States. We currently hold the record for the highest single-day spike in cases. Luckily, we also have the lowest case fatality rate among the world. That's 2.41%. It was in July, and probably it has come down to, it's steadily coming down now as our experience in managing these cases are increasing. Yet, we are already witnessing glimpses of this effect it has had on our society and economy. Every day, people are losing their jobs and income with no way of knowing when normalcy will come or will return. I was just going through recently, the International Labour Organization estimates that 195 million jobs could be lost and around 800 million people will not be able to meet their basic needs. Approximately 1.5 billion students globally remain at home as schools are closed. Online school is not a solution. This is going to cause serious social concerns. And why this happened? These are the consequences of our problematic relationship with the nature, which has deprived many species of their natural habitat, creating as a fertile ground for the zoonotic diseases. And what we have learned from these consequences is how fragile we humans are. A tiny virus has brought the world to a standstill. No national or international border could stop this worldwide pandemic from one small city of Wuhan to the entire world. In this situation of confusion, little bit of panicky, and little bit of worry, I think, there are many questions are in the mind, and probably these questions are in the mind of everyone. Everybody is concerned about these questions. I'll just mention a few of them, and then probably I'll proceed. Are we as a country prepared to handle much more corona pandemic or reinfection pandemic? The experts will be able to throw light on this. Is susceptibility and severity to corona genetically predisposed? Will we continue to see more reinfections? If the vaccine is available and the virus mutates, what could be the implications? And still, we are not aware about the long-term consequences of corona that they say like a cardiomyopathy, autoimmune diseases, and diabetes mellitus. Even it has been observed that many who have had the disease do not develop the antibodies. I think why so? That will have to also see. And including all this, being this is a seminar of the universities, I think we'll have to also think about how do we improve our research training in the undergraduate and postgraduate level. And this is the reason why we are gathered here today to discuss and deliberate upon the future of COVID-19 pandemic with today's keynote speaker, Dr. Raman Gangakhedkar. Raman Gangakhedkar is a pediatrician. I'm fortunate to be his batchmate for undergraduation and post-graduation. His academic journey has been exemplary and inspiring. Dr. Raman is a clinician. Dr. Raman is a researcher. Dr. Raman is a virologist. And Dr. Raman is also a public health person who did Masters of Public Health from Johns Hopkins University, United States. He has held several prestigious posts and worked in National Institute of Hemato-Oncology, National Institute of Virology, National AIDS Research Institute and developed so many national policies and protocols. He was head of epidemiology and communicable diseases in ICMR. During his tenure, he has handled outbreaks related to two deadly viruses, as the Nipah virus outbreak in Kerala and the recent coronavirus pandemic in India. Dr. Raman was the face of ICMR during government briefing in coronavirus pandemic. He was awarded the Padma Shri in 2020 for his service and research on HIV and AIDS. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Raman Ganga Khedkar to share his views on the future of COVID-19 pandemic. Raman, please, I think you take a dais, and it's over to Dr. Raman Ganga Khedkar, please.
Thank you, Nitin. No, it's very nice to hear from your own classmate. I don't know whether I would be able to live up to the expectations that you have. Now, how do you make this larger? Yeah. Now, what I'm going to do is quickly try and go over the future of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this particular talk that I'm giving, these are all my individual views, which are based on available evidence and interpretations. The reason why I need to caution is most often they are likely to be attributed to ICMR. However, I'm no longer a classical ICMR employee. I'm an honorary chair with ICMR. Now, let's try and look at COVID-19. Having seen the trailer for last 9 months, as if it's a horror story where unexpected challenging adversities almost become a norm, is it that perhaps it may turn out to be different? Is it a story that is akin to Alice in Wonderland? The world of Alice, which tends to become upside down temporarily, only to return back to normal, as a fairy tale kind of a story that we used to hear, and a movie that was made subsequently. Perhaps it was off their heads, kind of a remark that Red Queen had passed in Alice in Wonderland, which probably came true when Alice entered into a pangolin-like burrow, instead of a rabbit hole where she had gone. On January 1st, the world never realized that they were to wake up to a new reality, which could be a dreaded pandemic altogether. The first case from Wuhan, which came from Wuhan, occurred in India, was on January 30th in Kerala. March 11th, WHO declared it as pandemic, and now India has moved from an imported outbreak to an explosive epidemic at this point in time. We tend to have some convenience bias when it comes to strategies. One of the things which we have to realize, when we started off, there was very little availability of information from China. There were scary videos which tended to come on WhatsApp, and increasing numbers in a short period of time, which was visible in China, and use of military to lockdown in health was something which is very new, and it perhaps scared all the stakeholders. Some believe that perhaps it will be restricted to China and a few countries surrounding it, like SARS and MERS did. Some believe that it would spread rapidly. WHO declared it as pandemic after almost 2 months of report of the first case. Like Alice, who became curiouser and curiouser, certain things started surprising us. One of the most important things which we have to remember, that there are 6 mysteries of this particular mysterious disease. It's a multisystemic disease, and it moves from throat infection to multisystemic disease, something which is almost unheard of. However, you also need to remember that though this is multisystemic disease, there is no to very low transient viremia that tends to occur in this disease. The spectrum is predominantly, if you look at it, largely asymptomatic, and event-free, but a small proportion tends to have severe disease. Very low infection fatality rate as IFR as we call, but when it comes to physicians, the suddenly you see 10 to 15% of mortality rate, which is a mind-boggling figure. Reinfections are already being reported in a short span of time, and they are indicative of unreliable immune response after the infection. It causes sequelae even among asymptomatics is something which is really different for this particular disease. If you try to see how it moves from sore throat to pulmonary and then extrapulmonary manifestations of COVID-19, you find almost all systems getting affected. Let it be a neurologic system, whether it is kidneys, liver, gastrointestinal, thromboembolism as a phenomena, cardiac events, endocrine and dermatological picture is also seen among them, which is very fascinating to understand. This is a new disease and it perhaps poses one of the biggest challenges to researchers to understand its own immunopathology. Now, when you think in terms of pathophysiology of COVID, you find that the virus tends to enter through ACE2 receptors, ably assisted by TIMPRESS receptors there, and then enters into pneumocytes, and then you have whole plethora of things that tend to often be seen. One is the direct cytotoxic effect. You have dysregulation of RAS system. You have endothelial cell damage and thromboinflammation, and then dysregulated immune response, which leads to cytokine storm. And if you look at these four stages, they're absolutely mind-boggling in terms of what must be happening within the body. You look at the mechanism that even you see in neurologic diseases. It is not only restricted to inflammatory response or multi-organ failure, but you have vasculitis as a phenomenon, and even immune-mediated complications like encephalitis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, they tend to occur among human beings. Now, can we predict one of the things which perhaps comes as a challenge? Who is going to worsen? Things have improved, and today one of the worries which we had is, would we need all investigations, including inflammatory, cardiac, hepatic, and immunologic, all the time being done repeatedly? Perhaps not. There are some movements that are occurring. Some of these movements that you by and large see, they are something like a clinical score, which is called as CALL, a very simplified score that we are seeing, where presence of comorbidity, age, above 60 or below, lymphocyte count, and LDH, they are given certain points. And based on those points, if the points are above 6, they tell you fairly well that the patient is going to worsen. The sensitivity and specificity increases as the person's value goes 6 points or above. Now, when it comes to D-dimer level, one of the things which we have to realize is baseline D-dimer levels are now being recognized to be giving you outcomes which are probably associated with different organ damages that tend to occur. If you look at in this particular graph, raised D-dimer levels are 2.5 times more likely to lead to the critical illness. And similarly, if you look at thrombosis, the odds are close to 1.9, almost 2 times higher. When it comes to acute kidney injury, it's about 2.5 times higher if my baseline D-dimer levels are high. And the likelihood of discharge tends to go down dramatically if my D-dimer levels are high. If you look at all-cause mortality on the right graph, you suddenly start realizing there is a dose-response kind of a curve, which tends to tell you that the higher the D-dimer levels, the higher is the risk of death among these people. Now, what is also important to recognize, this is a different pandemic. The response is also extremely strong from the research fraternity now. Now, if you look at immunologic signatures in any other routine disease, you find that in other infectious diseases, this was almost like a pensioner's job. It was never prioritized as much. By and large, those infections which linger for a long period of time, people tended to work on immunologic signatures. But there is a productive progeria that you see in this disease, which is only 8 months old. Papers have already started coming up. Now, one of the issues that comes as a bigger challenge and why people started working even on such an issue earlier is the diversity tends to bother the scientists. About 10% of those who develop severe disease, they are found to have autoantibodies. Another 3% of them, they have certain genetic mutations. But at the same time, we also understand still don't have enough of understanding about polymorphism of toll-like receptors and TIMPRES, which are simultaneously seen on pneumocytes. Now, critical patients tend to have autoantibodies. If you try and see the autoantibodies and their association, you find among males, these autoantibodies are 5 times more likely to happen. Now, if you look at their age, if you are older than 65, the risk of development of these autoantibodies is close to 1.6 times higher, which essentially means age and gender tends to be extremely important in terms of development of autoimmune disease. When you try to look at what exactly is going wrong, like Dr. Nitin tended to refer to genetic makeup that we have, it is also found that there are certain genes which are gene variants are likely to be seen, and these gene variants determine this diversity. TLR3, the toll-like receptor 3, from which is also important for entry of this virus, and then interferon IRF7, interferon receptor factor. These are extremely important. IRF7 and IRF9. These are important from the point of view of genetic vulnerability. IRF7 has been associated with severe H1N1 infection, and general viral response tends to come through gene of IRF9. And these are now being increasingly recognized. Perhaps you might see there would be a change in the approach of determining who's likely to progress faster and who's likely to have a severe disease. Let us hope that we will be able to find out reasons for the clinical diversity quickly. As you read in Alice Wonderland, now here you see it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to go to somewhere else from where we came, where we want to go, you must run at least twice as fast. And that is essentially what is happening today in the research world. Can we manage these patients really well? If you look at the treatment, any new disease that tends to create panic, we have those old Giuseppe formula that tend to make the entry first because we don't understand so much about the disease. Vitamin C and D, zinc, chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, haldi or curcumin, and BCG. These are these are old candidates which were even seen when HIV was first discovered. People started working on these molecules. By and large, this disease has created so much of panic that computer docking studies that we do to find out which molecule perhaps can work against a virus or new germ, you find that docking studies suddenly led to off-label use such as ivermectin, ACE2 receptors, tocilizumab, itolizumab, and then favipiravir. However, the best that currently tends to reign is the quality supportive care, steroids and remdesivir in that particular order at this time point. But we are learning fast and we are dropping those which are not effective as such. And therefore, we have started moving from inductive reasoning that we had to include others, move towards deductive logic in terms of its application. I'm trying to focus more on those which are currently misused so that we don't use them at all at this time point. One is ivermectin. Ivermectin is unlikely to reach a required blood level in the lungs because you need almost 100 times more human dose. And there's hardly any point in giving this particular drug. There is no robust evidence that is currently available though it works in docking studies, it also works in XYO studies as such. When it comes to the anti-HIV drugs, which were also used, the boosted lopinavir and cobicistat and darunavir combination, both of them are more likely to work on two enzymes which are important in replication of this particular virus. However, both of late have been found to have no clinical impact, and therefore use of these particular drugs needs to be discouraged at this time point. When it comes to hydroxychloroquine, oh, I'm sorry, there is a typo. It should be azithromycin with hydroxychloroquine or only hydroxychloroquine. There is no clinical benefit and there is emergence of high toxicity, especially long QTC that you might see. There is no evidence yet for clinical use such as IVIG, mesenchymal stem cells, the interferons, IL-1 inhibitor like anakinra, then IL-6 receptor inhibitors like sarilumab, anti-IL-6 monoclonal antibodies like siltuximab and itolizumab. These should not be used at this point in time. Neither kinase inhibitors or JAK inhibitors are likely to be useful. There is no evidence as of now. Most of these drugs continue to remain in experimental mode. When it comes to this particular disease, there are three different stages. When the infection tends to occur, you find innate immune responses tend to come and they cover you until the second phase or respiratory phase that tends to follow. But after the respiratory phase, the cytokine storm is more likely to occur. And at that juncture, it is adaptive immunity which is working. Now, if I want to give something to a patient who is likely to land into cytokine storm, I need to provide immunomodulatory therapy, perhaps between 5 to 7 days, as it has been shown in the arrow here when the patient develops respiratory symptoms. The pendulum, and the reason why I am quoting this is tocilizumab. If you actually look at Covacta trial, which was conducted by Roche, the original manufacturer, there was no difference in infection, no difference between placebo and tocilizumab, but still they reported that additionally the infection rate tends to be 4 times higher. So they gave up on tocilizumab, and moreover, Sanofi, which was also like working on similar kind of molecule, also gave up the development of their own new molecule after learning from this tocilizumab trial. Now, a few days back, Roche itself published another Impacta trial, which is a phase 3 trial, and there they found that it tends to protect patients with pneumonia from either putting them on ventilation or they dying due to this particular infection by almost 44%. But though this protects it, there is no difference in 28-day mortality, which essentially means that you would protect your patients from going on ventilator. You would perhaps try to ensure that this molecule would be useful in cytokine storm management itself. However, there was no additionally difference in infection rates because when you provide these monoclonal antibodies, the fear is some infections which are lying in our own body, which are latent, they tend to come up. The infection rate was found to be close to about 5%. However, we need to worry still in India, though final call has not yet been taken about tocilizumab, that in India, you have LTBI, that is latent tuberculosis infection, is far more common. And that's our bigger worry, which we have to manage. When it comes to use of corticosteroid, no, this is something which was revealed by a recovery trial, where they tended to show that it reduces the risk of mortality by almost 17%. And those who go on mechanical ventilation, among them, the risk of mortality was reduced by almost 36%. If you see the meta-analysis, you find that the all-cause mortality, if you provide steroids, is reduced by 25%, and the duration of mechanical ventilation is almost 5 days lesser if you if I provide steroids. But when should I be providing these steroids? You need to remember when and how. No, one of the things which we have to remember that once the patient lands up into moderate disease, you provide steroids as such. How much of steroid? If I'm providing dexamethasone 6 milligram per day for 10 days only, or lesser if the patient is discharged, and this should be done at a time when the patient is either on ventilator or requiring oxygen supplement. It should never be given to those who don't need oxygen. Dexamethasone, if I don't want to start, I could substitute it with methylprednisolone 32 milligram, prednisolone with 40 milligram, and hydrocortisone of 160 milligram. But the frequency at which you have to provide varies by the half-life of each individual chemical entity. Now, when it comes to remdesivir, there is no difference in all-cause mortality, whether at 44 days or 28 days. However, the recovery time tends to improve with remdesivir. It goes to 11 days if I provide remdesivir versus 15 days if I provide placebo to that individual. There is a significantly shorter time to recovery, and it appears to be useful in 10 days of being symptomatic, which essentially means there is a small window for us to initiate remdesivir. Ideally, it should be used in moderate to severe disease. However, looking at 10 days of being symptomatic, one may take a call appropriately as to when one should start. Now, when you provide this regimen, you have 5 days, which are almost equal to 10 days when it comes to statistical difference in outcomes. So one should prefer 5 days. However, in some cases which persist with symptoms, you may continue to provide it up to 10 days. One most important thing which we must remember that we should never use it along with rifampicin because of its impact on SIP, and that could be detrimental for that patient. All of us know that majority of these patients, they tend to have received thromboprophylaxis, and you have antiviral drugs which could also create a drug interaction. One must remember that the significant toxicities or drug interactions which are to be avoided are by and large with boosted lopinavir. Rest of them you may continue to have it because they do not produce any clinically significant impact even if you use different molecules which are antiaggregants, thrombolytic, or anticoagulants. One of the best molecules that you see are by and large those which have green shades across, which you can choose from the list. When it comes to convalescent plasma, no, even today, US FDA tends to have US FDA has given emergency use authorization. However, Mayo study and ICMR trial have shown that there is no difference even if you provide convalescent plasma. So it should not be treated as standard of care. We may have to wait for robust evidences. But the confusion continues because few days back, probably 2 or 3 days back, a new study, which is a case control study, has been recently published, which tends to show that the risk of survival is essentially higher in patients who receive plasma, convalescent plasma, and it should be given to less severely ill patients. So the confusion will continue to be there. Firm line can only be taken if we have data from few more RCTs which could become available soon. Now, one of the reasons why we get worried is the moment you put a drug into emergency use authorization, the panic is so high even among healthcare providers that the emergency use authorization is confused with standard of care. What is most important for us to remember, whether it is off-label use or emergency use authorization, you need to take informed consent. You have to give unbiased information on unknown efficacy or adverse events that are likely to occur need to be flagged off. And you need to provide quality support care as standard of care. You need to highlight the same when you take the consent. One of the lessons that we have learned is panic among all stakeholders is always counterproductive. Avoiding excessive use of ventilators that are associated with higher mortality has paid bigger dividends than what we have seen so far. Now, one of the things is as in Alice in Wonderland, she tends to get that Vorpal sword. Will there be an effective drug? And perhaps we will be able to conquer this disease better. We have to remember that currently we are focusing on repurposed molecules because it is easy. Repurposed molecules can pass through clinical trials faster because you don't need to worry about known side effects, which already exist there. Are they really useful? Yes, they are. Now, if you look at HIV, the first molecule which was discovered against it was zidovudine, which was 5 years after the first cases that have been reported. It was a repurposed molecule from a drug library that was maintained in a university, and it led to a revolution. Now, when it comes to hepatitis C, no, the repurposing of lamivudine and tenofovir, you suddenly find now hepatitis C has so many drugs to actually choose from. Now you are also watching for new monoclonal antibodies, which are likely to be utilized even against COVID-19 virus. The ones which are likely to penetrate better as are being discovered as of now, and trials may soon begin. We as human beings are extremely smart. Now, though smallpox was eradicated in 1972, just to just to see that the risk of it being used as a bioterrorism agent, we discovered a new drug which works against smallpox, which is called as tecovirimat in 2018. It's just that we did not work on coronaviruses, which we should have. What we have to remember is we should hope to have the first lead soon, and perhaps that effective drug will be extremely useful. One most important lesson that we must have is it's no use going back to yesterday because I was a different person then. The way it was told in Alice in Wonderland. Now, where are we in terms of numbers as of now? The numbers that Dr. Nitin did talk about India as well as the global numbers, and they tend to be really scary. No, when it comes to India, we need to remember that we have about 18% detected cases. 18% of the total cases in the world are in India, and there are 9% of the global deaths that have occurred because of COVID-19, which are reported from India as of September 26. This is despite the fact that we had a lockdown. Perhaps we take done because non-pharmacological interventions were proven to be successful by China and the first in Lancet. The imported cases and mobility, the imported cases and mobility, the imported cases, test, trace, and isolate was the main strategy. Mobility is considered as crucial for exposure. Our lockdown started in March 20 on March 24th. There were two episodes of focal outbreak which led to its prolongation. The success of this particular lockdown was we delayed the outbreak for a long period of time, though we had a major challenge that we had to handle migrants and economy, which was unavoidable. The lockdown helped us enhance the production of PPEs, disinfectants, ventilators, RT-PCR machines, the reagents along with ICUs and trained manpower. One must also remember that even procuring RT-PCR machines and reagents was extremely tough at a time when the entire world was trying to pay whatever it comes to buy these things from China and other places where it was manufactured. But today we have become Atmanirbhar in every possible way. This is the longest lockdown in the world. We bought the time to strengthen healthcare services, but at the same time, we know there is a seesaw balance. No, economic impact and health outcomes had to be balanced really well. Today, if you look at 7-day moving average of new cases per day, in India, you find there is a drop. But this drop, does it reflect a reality? Perhaps not, because not all places, not all states are offering testing at equal rates if you want to actually look at an overall graph at this point in time. But the scare continues despite all this. As the lockdown is being lifted, the numbers in metropolitan cities could worry us for a long period of time, because the numbers could be huge. Healthcare services in rural areas would be another area of concern, and fatigue among healthcare workers is another thing which we may have to fight with domestically. If you actually look at the impact of temperature, population density, and social distancing on the reproduction rate, that is R0, you will find that the higher the temperature, the better it is. And social distancing, even if it is reduced by a minimal number, when population density is low, perhaps it works really well. But when it comes to metropolitan cities like Mumbai, you find high temperature favors us, but the overall population density of even Mumbai is 73,000 people per square mile. One needs to have majority who would be maintaining social distancing, which is very, very challenging to bring the R0 to less than 1. Animal models tend to suggest that there is an inverse relationship between temperature and transmission of influenza and other coronaviruses, which means higher the transmission, higher the temperature, lower is the risk of transmission. However, high humidity increases viability and transmission of this virus through fomites, which, even if the impact of aerosol transmission can be reduced to a larger extent in these respiratory diseases. What is more worrisome? No, if you actually see that of all the 100% cases, 70% infected individuals don't infect anyone else. But 80% of the new infections tend to come from 20% of these cases, which essentially means that they must have some super spreading event which could make such a difference, and larger transmissions can occur. Where can these super spreading events occur? One of the studies classically shows that if you are working, if you are sitting in an area where there is a prolonged contact and poor air circulation, you will find the risk of transmission tends to be high. Whether it is workshops, whether it is bus or temple, depending on how they are, you will find they will suddenly become important places. And this is something which we have to keep at the back of mind when the lockdown is being lifted in the current stages. So essentially, what does it mean? The strategies that we have to adopt will be different, whether it is for urban conglomerates like metropolitan cities, the towns, as well as the rural areas. You need to have an adjustable seesaw and try to calibrate your own strategies in such a manner that they could impact the outcome well. One issue that is always talked of, are we testing enough? If you look at the two of these graphs, you suddenly realize that our seropositivity rates are lower in comparison with other countries compared to the tests per 100,000, that is 1 lakh population. You find test per 1 lakh population is low. Despite that, our seropositivity rates are also not so high. Though they are around 7.5% as of now, WHO suggests that less than 5% seropositivity is vital. That leads to another issue in our minds. Now, is our outbreak yet to mature? Is it a reflection of the test kits that are being used? One must remember that we have still not matured is something which we have to keep at the back of mind. We also need to remember that one of the advisories which ICMR had released was every negative rapid test in a symptomatic individual must be followed with RT-PCR. Otherwise, you are likely to miss a significant or perhaps larger proportion of patients who are positive, and they could spread this infection just because of the sensitivity and specificity issues between RT-PCR and then subsequent follow-up of this rat antigen test that has been developed. When will we peak is another question that we tend to worry about. Ours is an imported outbreak. There is a heterogeneity in maturity of the outbreak. There is a heterogeneity in level of outbreak in different states also. The drivers of the epidemic are population density, migration, and mobility. And mobility makes it extremely difficult to control in given areas. And that's one of the reasons why you find that metropolitan cities have a larger peak as of now, more mature outbreaks. When it comes to towns, it is little lesser. And in rural areas, it's still lesser. If you look at overall peak in India, perhaps it's not likely to come very quickly. You will have a wider peak that you will achieve. Maybe you might have stability that will come in after a pretty long period of time. Now, can I control this particular infection? It's difficult to control. One of the reasons is if you look at what we now understand about secondary transmission, you find that the person transmits this infection to another person within 2 days before he becomes symptomatic and 2 days subsequently. That's one of the most common place where the occurrence of transmission can occur. Now, if you try to see that, you find that when the patient doesn't know he is infected, in only 2 days prior to becoming symptomatic, 41% of transmissions can occur. And once he becomes symptomatic in next 2 days, 35% of transmissions that tend to occur. The remaining 24% transmissions, they tend to occur in 3 to 10 days time after development of symptoms. So essentially it means no matter what I would try to do, 41% of transmissions would be difficult to control unless we change certain norms, which we will try and see subsequently. We have also learned that certain smaller countries like New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan have controlled this particular outbreak really well. And the largest country, China, has also done it really well. But there is one thing which we are seeing. Smaller outbreaks tend to occur even in those places where it was controlled periodically. So the lesson that we have to learn, even in the best case scenarios, one cannot lose guard. Early detection, isolation, and contact tracing is extremely vital for all of us to remember. Will there be a second wave in India? You see classically that India has started showing a dip. When it comes to UK, you see a second peak that is already occurring. Perhaps second wave is unlikely to be seen as an overall picture. It may occur in some small places, or localized second waves can also be seen in parts of the country. What is important for us to understand, if I want to reduce it, contact tracing is extremely vital. But when it comes to contact tracing, there is a stigma that tends to exist. There is a fear of death, ostracization, probability of finding a family member to be infected. So people tend to hide their infection. They also testing, and they also don't inform the other contacts, close contacts, that they are infected. In diagnosis that tends to occur, you will find different events, transmissions, but at the same time, one must remember that if you stay within the family, the people who you can infect, even if you stay in the family, is the lowest. And compare that with the social events, compare that with travel and work, you find that within family, the risk of transmission would be lower compared to rest of the places. And this becomes important to avoid social functions. That's the reason you find that most often we talk of number of people who could attend social events to be restricted to a larger numbers on large occasions. Precautions to prevent COVID-19 infection, they continue to remain the same. Correct use of mask because you want to avoid transmission from asymptomatic people. Stay 6 feet away from non-family members and wash hands often. One of the worst things that we have to remember is even Spanish flu, SARS, and MERS, all of these were respiratory infections. We remember them most often today, but we have to remember even those are even reading that or experiencing that, our practice of precaution not change for long. We need to involve communities. If everybody minded their own business of protecting self and family, the world would go around a great deal faster than it does. All mad here. When it comes to the masks, we are not using it right way, and that's a message that we need to pass off everywhere. If we want to improve that, the acceptance and sustaining of non-pharmacological interventions, we may have to have community engagement. There are two different models, peer-led model and CPOL model. We could use BCC to augment that and ensure that people accept these interventions and practice them well. Now, a different issue tends to come up. There's something called as long haulers or post-COVID syndrome. Now, there are two kinds of post-COVID syndromes that we are seeing. One is a post-acute COVID, that is within 3 weeks of becoming, after becoming symptomatic. And when it comes to chronic COVID, it is defined as something which occurs if the symptoms are seen beyond 12 weeks after the symptom. And 10% of the COVID cases are reported to actually have become long haulers at this juncture. This proportion also varies as of now. Some people say that 1/3 of those are likely to become long haulers. Now, if you look at the symptoms, there is a persistence of symptoms. 87% of those people who had infection, they have at least one persistent symptom. And most often it is fatigue, dyspnea, or fatigue and dyspnea, but none of these cases are likely to have fever. And if you actually see that tend to persist in some individuals even up to 60 days after development of symptoms. Now, if you try to think who are likely to become persisters, one must have certain information in mind that 35% of the patients are likely to become persisters. Age over 50, about 2.29% times they would have a higher risk of becoming persisters. If you have more than 3 underlying chronic morbid conditions, the risk perhaps increases by 2.29 times again. If I am obese, BMI is above 30, the risk of one becoming persister is 2.31 times higher. And if I have a psychiatric condition, the risk is 2.3-fold higher if I have that as an underlying condition. Why do they become long haulers? There are different theories that are coming. Now, this particular phenomena was also observed in SARS and MERS. Now, certain things which are associated, which are attributed it to, are unmasking of underlying comorbidities, residual damage from acute infection, persistent or restricted viral replication, poor immune response or reinfection or relapse, persistent immune activation, post-stress traumatic disorder, and unknown causes are also being referred to. Now, there is a distinct way of managing these symptoms which are less likely to be difficult to handle. Most often you find exercise, whether it is respiratory or physical, is given as one approach to handle these infections, along with certain specialized recommendations if somebody develops cardiac complications or neurologic complications, or also thromboembolic complications, you need to consult an appropriate specialist. Now, what are the precautions that you need to take after COVID-19 infection? You need to continue to correctly use mask, maintain social distance, and also wash hands often, even if you are infected at this juncture. That is mainly because reinfections are also being increasingly reported. These are also being reported for other coronaviruses such as OC43 and HKU1. But after a certain period of time, it appears that this period is perhaps earlier in coronaviruses. The rough estimate, now is this likely to be higher? The rough estimate currently, the only paper that has come out, tends to say that it is 0.04%. People may experience reinfection, but this proportion may vary over a period of time. What is the good news? Reinfected are to transfer infections to others. And what is also important to remember that cross protection from other coronavirus infections is a questionable or a debatable issue even today. You must also have had heard about two cases of reinfections that have been reported by Noida. If you actually see the sequences, you find that the dark bars that you are seeing are different in both E1 and E2. So the first infection was different, the second one infection was different, and the same is also seen in the second case at this juncture. Four new cases have also been reported from Bombay among these healthcare workers. So it may be a phenomenon which may be occurring more often than we have realized. Do we think that COVID-19 will impact us on a long-term basis? Perhaps not, unless you consider 3 to 4 years as a longer term. No, one needs to be optimistic that we might have new, better drugs or vaccines, perhaps sometime in the next year itself. However, there are certain things which we must remember, that it is more likely to become endemic, and it may also become seasonal, because when you evoke a herd immunity, whether through vaccination, whether it is through infection, it is likely to become seasonal. The new norms are likely to continue to exist for quite some time. Industries are likely to become more mechanized. There is a long-term impact on living. New economic order is likely to emerge. And the way we look at life for happiness perhaps will change over a period of time. What about vaccines? You will find that currently, there are different platforms that are being used. Many of them are for the first time ever. And there are close to about 170 groups that are working. Currently, 26 vaccines are in human trials. Now, one thing we must remember, adenovirus is used as a vector more often. Adenovirus infection is more common, and presence of antibodies against adenoviruses may affect the take of COVID vaccine. But there is one thing which we must remember, that the Russian vaccine uses two different strains of adenoviruses which do not affect heterologous immunity or immunogenicity of these strains. And that's why, to me, there is advantage which Sputnik vaccine has. And this particular vaccine has an additional advantage, that it has a formulation which is frozen and lyophilized as well. Frozen requires transport in minus 80 degrees, which is impossible to happen in India. So you need a lyophilized vaccine, which is more stable, so that it becomes easy to provide it to others. Additionally, there is some good news. Recently, Bharat Biotech has entered into a collaboration to develop a nasal vaccine. Now, to me, it will evoke mucosal immune response, because you want mucosal immune response to stop entry of this virus inside our body. Will vaccine induced immune protection be overestimated in these trials now that they have become shorter? Now, this is an endpoint challenge. Now, we need to remember that I also need to see how many infections are averted by provision of vaccine. But when I do that, I need to also factor asymptomatic infections, which essentially means that I may have to test all the contacts who are coming in my vicinity, and that becomes difficult if your period of this vaccine trial is going to be 18 months. So it is likely that it will be an overestimation in terms of efficacy here. There are additionally certain unanswered questions. There are very low to no titers of neutralizing antibody which are being reported in 81 to 94 days after infection. We don't know the impact on efficacy at this juncture. There are new reports of T cell sensitization, so you don't bother about neutralizing antibody as much. We don't know how long this protection will last, especially the IgG antibody that it will develop. Will it give me protection through pneumocytes and enterocytes, where you want mucosal immunity to work best? How long will this efficacy last? And whether it will be efficacious in older individuals and children. older individuals is more important because they have a high mortality and vaccine associated adverse events as well. There are certain key issues that we need to remember. That global vaccine production capacity is 2.5 billion per year. Majority of the vaccines are two-dose vaccines. So in a given year, you can perhaps immunize 125 crore people across the world. Therefore, you need to prioritize populations, which could be healthcare workers, frontline workers, and comorbid workers. But we still don't know how would be the uptake of these vaccines as such. If you actually look at one of the estimates, the number of years that you will require for entire world to be vaccinated would perhaps be 5 years, depending on different populations and the calculations that have been done across. So please don't think that once the vaccine will come, I'm going to receive it right away and things will be stalled unless you are belonging to those high priority groups as such. There are some who believe that very few among us will actually require a COVID vaccine because we know from our own ICMR surveys, seroprevalence rates in containment zones were high and they are close to that expected in herd immunity. So the proportion that may require for in the immediate future is likely to be lower is a question that we have to think about. But this issue of herd immunity, whether antibodies protect or whatever, tends to give jitters to the vaccine manufacturers because they have to understand how many doses do they need to produce, because you will essentially screen people with IgG antibodies providing because you don't want to have a repeat of dengue vaccine which once provided to somebody who's infected can lead to severe dengue infection. Vaccine manufacturers have additionally an accentuated dilemma. They need to produce it fastest so that perhaps they can get the market. But when you produce it fast, when you do trials fast, fast tracking may perhaps not affect the estimation of vaccine efficacy as much, but it will affect the understanding about adverse events that may occur because you are going to look at them for a short period of time. And after taking the vaccine, you will know about these adverse events. There are well-known adverse events that are associated with it, vaccine-associated illnesses. But there is one thing which we must remember. Vaccine-associated adverse events are generally very rare. Now, if you look at this particular issue, these are adult vaccinations which we have never done in our country well. If you look at free H1N1 vaccine that was provided in Maharashtra, you find that the uptake of this vaccine has been extremely poor between 2015 to July 2020. When it comes to provision of tetanus and diphtheria during pregnancy, you find our performance is extremely poor. And that's something which we have to really worry about. Why do we worry about this more? Because if you want to actually protect the people best, the vaccine efficacy and coverage would be interrelated. You have herd immunity, which will protect sometime around 58% people if they acquire infection. But if you want to protect the entire population, then you have different scenarios which tell you what should be your vaccine coverage given the vaccine protection that would be seen in the clinical trials as such. Therefore, community involvement holds the key. High level of panic can lead to social unrest for getting vaccines. And also at the same time, if there is low faith on data that emerges from clinical trials, there could be a significant proportion of people who may refuse to get vaccinated. But should we be really gloomy at this point in time? Perhaps not. If you look at our vaccine development past, now one of the things which you will realize that all vaccines required huge number of years to develop these vaccines and even they becoming ready for people to use. But when it comes to SARS-CoV-2, you find that within 8 months, you currently have 26 products that are undergoing trials at this juncture. And what is most important is you have a huge vaccine development program which is looking at newer approaches to provide vaccines which may eventually prove successful. The future is everybody's guess is as good as one's. New normal is likely to continue to remain there, and these pictures tend to suggest to you that this is unlikely to go in next 3 to 4 years time. Sometimes have believed in as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Now, this is something which we reiterated to begin with. There are 6 things which were puzzling, but things are changing. What is most important for us is we need to provide a ray of hope to the next generation, which is looking at the future through glasses, a social isolation. Unless we work hard, unless we treat well, things may not change. But there is a hope that new drugs will come, new monitoring tests will come, and what is important is a vaccine would come which could be successful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your deep insights into various aspects of COVID-19 pandemic. I now invite Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Shashank Dalvi, sir, for moderating the session and making the concluding remarks.
Very enlightening speech by Dr. Raman Gangakadkar. Sir, I am also the alumni. My alma mater is also Government Medical College, Aurangabad, and we are in teaching profession. So though I am few years, not more than 2 years senior to you, sir, but you have explained various questions and the queries which the audience or learned participants, those are having in this webinar, but still there are few questions, those have come here, which I would like to discuss and your opinion on those queries so that their enthusiasm will be satisfied. The one query is regarding the current status of convalescent plasma therapy and HCQS prophylaxis.
SCQ.
Did
you say convalescent plasma and SCQ?
Yes, yes.
No, currently we speak.
Yeah.
See, ours was a randomized control trial, and we found there is no effect of convalescent plasma. However, one must understand that you can't make a judgment so easily. Though we have published, we said that it is of no use, one must remember that we may have to refine the test for antibodies. Though we tested for neutralizing antibodies in NIV, we may have to further refine using different antibody, which could perhaps lead us to a better answer. But as of now, as I told in the presentation itself, that only in USA, it is considered as emergency use authorization, but not as a standard of care. In India, people have started using it. We don't know whether it would be beneficial. This is an off-label use, so you can't stop the same. But what I would suggest is, if at all, if it may work when the infection is very recent. Once the infection establishes, once it goes to development of respiratory problems, you perhaps will find it difficult to get any kind of benefit, if at all, if it comes. And SCQ, I think SCQ prophylaxis as well as SCQ for treatment is almost gone as of now. None of us would recommend that.
Thank you. Now, the second is regarding what are long-term consequences of corona, like cardiomyopathy, autoimmune diseases, diabetes mellitus.
Now, this is a difficult question because when you ask long-term complications, the long is only 8 months. Not all people even had post-infection, perhaps 6 to 7 months time to be actually seen and being followed up at this juncture. But we understand that it is going to have likely to have a wider impact, and that's the reason in one of the slides I said different organs that are also involved in acute COVID-19 infection. We have to wait to see whether it is going to increase the risk of development of diabetes, which is currently being thought of, a lot thought of than otherwise. Whether it is like, I won't know whether it would be cardiomyopathy, but at the same time, one thing which is becoming important is myocarditis, perhaps leading to unexplained deaths among these people. There could be long-term problems that may be recognized over a period of time. Currently, they are in speculative realm, mainly because the time which we had to see for all these is low. But one issue which I would be more worried about is lung fibrosis. And we don't know whether lung fibrosis would resolve. We know that the treatment for lung fibrosis can also be frustrating. So all post-COVID cases, at least advise them pranayam and bhasrika. We don't know whether the drugs will work. They are currently under trial. But we should be cautious. And that is the simple reason why I keep on saying, even if majority of the people don't develop any complication, just don't test COVID-19 infection, because we'll come to know about its impact, long-term impact, when we won't be able to do much in future.
Thank you, sir. The one more question that our Pro VC also mentioned in is, as a country, are we prepared to handle more such corona-like pandemics?
Now, to be honest, to be very transparent, no, Nipah taught me one thing, that we need to have One Health approach in order to detect new infections, which I tried. I had only 2.5 years stint there. Now, I established what is called a Center for One Health in Nagpur for the first time, now which is an upcoming institution as part of NIV. I also dreamt of starting what is called integrated surveillance, where the animal husbandry, the agriculture, the human and environment related people work together on common issues. And this is extremely important, not only from infections, but tomorrow my bigger worry is the superbugs that are going to come, the antimicrobial resistance that is emerging higher. But we don't have this system as of now. Loosely in ICMR, we brought them together, but established system is yet to come. I think COVID is an eye-opener. We had good discussions with ministers, and we perhaps will also be submitting a plan as to how we should be handling these kind of outbreaks subsequently. Over.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Now, there are some questions, but we would like to answer those on emails. But one last question before the concluding remarks, that is regarding some doctors claim that coconut water, citrus juice, breathing exercise control the disease progression and minimizes the cost and health on burden. Are these scientific, or we should be, what is your view on this particular thing?
As a researcher, I would not believe on loose statements. Perhaps what is required is evidence. No, that kind of evidence doesn't exist. Now, it's very easy to claim success in a disease where majority of the people perhaps are likely to just even escape hospitalization, and a small minority that gets hospitalized would only see a severe event or deaths as such. Now, success is almost assured by this particular infection. So if I don't have a randomized control trial design, if I cannot remove the biases, selection biases especially, I will perhaps never be able to say whether a treatment works really well. I think it is important at this time point to ensure that we go for evidence-based treatment plans rather than uh, taking anything that comes to one's own mind. And if you actually see, that's the reason why I included ivermectin, azithromycin, and hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D, vitamin C. No, there was no necessity, or zinc for that matter. No, these are issues which we have to keep at the back of mind. No, if you actually think of how people take medicines, if zinc has become popular, people will keep on taking zinc now, even post-COVID. Now, if that happens, they don't know that it is going to reduce your copper levels in the body. And if copper levels go down, the implications are unknown to them. I think it would be important to be prescribing drugs rationally rather than believing on anecdotes. Over.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Now, as such, we are very happy to hear from Dr. Raman Gangakhedkar regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and what will be the future about this. Sir, you have explained logically the present status, also the various areas that you have very nicely covered, the drugs, the lessons learned from the COVID-19. Also, you have explained lockdown, how it helped. There are many questions in the mind that you also explained regarding the peak, second wave, localized outbreak, persistence, and what will be the exactly future of this particularly the pandemic that you have explained very, very nicely. The chances of reinfection, the cross protection and all that, and what is exactly the vaccine and how much we should depend on the vaccine. That also you have explained very nicely. And everybody is aware the research is going on for this particular disease in all the areas. Say in the areas of disease, as you have mentioned, this is the disease of mystery. And in the transmission and the affection of the body and the various parts. So in every area that research is going on. The research is going on for diagnostic facilities or diagnosis, laboratory diagnosis. Recently also the Abbott has invented one more test that is US FDA approved, more sensitive and more specific, that is being told. Also for the treatment, as you have rightly mentioned, the research is going on. The ICMR has given, even in the guidelines, it is given that it is the investigational therapy. Though at present 100% cure drug, that is not, but still those are investigational therapy and those are giving the good results. So the research is going on that particular direction also. Herd immunity, you have very, very nicely mentioned, sir. Regarding the herd immunity, only herd immunity will be the solution just by allow the infection to spread, or by the vaccine and the infection with this herd immunity, and what should be the level? These are the some questions, but the answer will come in future only. Nearly 60 to 70%, then only the disease spread in the population may stop with this. With the one more issue that is worrying, that is regarding the mutation, whether in which direction that will occur, whether that should occur in a favorable direction, then we will be happy. But in mutation can go in any particular direction. Then post-COVID management, also you have mentioned very nicely. This has area recently came up as the disease is only 6 to 7 months old. So post-COVID management of the patients. Regarding nutritional supplements, there are large number of things, those are going on. But still, as a person from community medicine, I will say that the balanced diet, exercise, sleep will give you adequate sleep that will give you the sufficient immunity, exercise, balanced diet and all that. But still there are certain elements that are advised also, like in the post-COVID treatment also the Chyawanprash and the Ashwagandha, those may help for the production of the immunity. One important aspect I would like to mention regarding the health education, due to this IT technology that has become the blessings as well as disguise also sometimes. Lot of WhatsApp messages regarding the information on the COVID-19, YouTube videos on the COVID-19, and how much correct information and how much wrong. So all the learned speakers, learned audience for this particular webinar, I will say only that the authentic websites of the ICMR, WHO, CDC Atlanta, and the speakers like Dr. Raman Gangakhedkar sir, who will give us the very authentic information. And as you have mentioned, the prevention is at present in our hand. And the last few slides that regarding the prevention, those are in our hands. And if we follow those particular things, we will be able to fight with COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us on this particular occasion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful discussion and for the concluding remarks. I now invite Dr. Rajesh Goel, Registrar, MGM Institute of Health Sciences, to give the vote of thanks. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Rita. On behalf of MGMIHS, I feel honored and privileged to propose vote of thanks. At the outset, let me we are deeply grateful to Dr. Raman Gangakhedkar sir, former head of epidemiology and infectious disease at ICMR, for gracing this national webinar as eminent speaker. Sir, we deeply appreciate the precious time you have spared for this seminar. Your talk here today has enlightened us tremendously. Our heartiest thanks to Honorable Chancellor MGMIHS and Chairman MGM Trust, Shri Kamal Kishore Kadam sir, for continuous encouragement and support during these difficult times, as always he has been doing. I would like to express my profound gratitude to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Shashank Dalvi sir, for his untiring efforts to host such scientific sessions to keep things moving, and also for moderating today's seminar. I must express my deep gratitude to Pro Vice Chancellor MGMIHS, Dr. Nitin Kadam sir, and Dr. Sudhir Kadam sir, Medical Director and Trustee, for their initiatives and valuable inputs for this webinar. I must thank Honorable Chancellor of MGM University Aurangabad, Dr. Baburao Kadam sir, for his gracious presence. My sincere thanks to Dr. P.M. Jadhav sir, Vice Chairman MGM Trust, and Honorable BO members of MGMIHS. A big and sincere thanks to all chancellors, pro-vice chancellors, pro-chancellors, vice chancellors, and other academicians from various eminent universities. To name a few, special thanks to Dr. Praveen Shingare sir, pro-chancellor, KIMS Karad, Dr. Rajendra Vikhe Patil, pro-chancellor, Pravara Institute of Medical Sciences, Loni, Dr. Mridula Phadke madam, former vice chancellor, MUHS, Dr. Shirish Patil, Vice Chancellor, DY Patil, Navi Mumbai, Dr. Rajesh Mudgal, Vice Chancellor, DY Patil University, Kolhapur. Your all participation shows the keen interest of all of us to fight the pandemic by all means. My sincere thanks to all institute heads under MGMIHS to encourage their faculties to participate in the webinar in big numbers. I also thank IQAC Coordinator, MGMIHS, Dr. Rita Khadkikar, and IQAC Coordinator, Aurangabad Campus, Dr. Swati Shiradkar, for their efforts in hosting this webinar, and look forward for such scientific sessions in future as well. Last but not the least, I would like to thank the IT departments, especially Anil and university staff, for the exclusive support for this webinar. Finally, I take this opportunity to thank everyone who has contributed directly or indirectly in making this webinar successful. Thank you all. Now, with this note, I declare this webinar as closed with kind request to all the participants to leave the webinar through this Zoom platform. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.